View it later. All right, so I've got a slideshow that will be on that screen here, and then I'll just kind of be talking through this. But I would like this to be very informal. So if you got questions as I go through, do not hesitate to ask, and we can talk about anything. Some of this gets, fairly kind of detailed in the history of beer. If I start losing you guys, tell me to move forward. And sorry I don't have samples, though. I know that makes this topic a little more exciting, but there are some beer distribution laws, the way Tennessee and really the United States works on distributing beer. And so with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to kind of go through and talk about beer when it first originated about 13,000 years ago. And then it really kind of developed in the Middle Ages, and then the Industrial Revolution really changed the brewing process. And that's really, beer has not changed for the past couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, as we know it today. Then we'll talk a little bit about how breweries got into Nashville and how the Nashville Brewing Company got started. So first, I'd just like to talk about what actually is beer. Has anyone ever heard the term liquid bread? So used a lot, especially during Lent. The monks in the Middle Ages, when they were brewing beer, they would be fasting. So they would make a stronger beer with more grains and higher alcohol, but ultimately to supplement their calorie intake during the Lent process while they were fasting. So it's called a fasting beer. But really, beer is essentially bread, the same ingredients with the exception of hops. But for thousands of years, beer was essentially grains, primarily barley, and water. And that is really all it is. Hops got added about 1,000 years ago, started getting added and became a regular ingredient in beer about 500 years ago. And then the magic ingredient is yeast. But the problem is no one knew what yeast was until we had the microscope a couple hundred years ago. Prior to that, no one really knew that was an ingredient that made things happen. And for those that don't know, for beer or wine, to create alcohol, you need sugars and you need yeast. And the yeast eats those sugars and creates alcohol, and then the byproduct is carbon dioxide. So that's the same thing for beer and wine. And really the difference between beer and wine, beer is alcohol made from a grain, and wine is alcohol made from a fruit. So if you think of it that way, that kind of differentiates the two. And then you got hard liquor, which is basically a distilled wine or a distilled beer. Like whiskey is a distilled beer. So let's go back to about 11,000. Yes. So hops are actually a flower. They are grown on a vine, and ultimately they offset they're very bitter, and they offset the sweetness in beer because basically it's a real sweet liquid, but also they act as a natural preservative. And we'll get into that a little bit more, why that became the important ingredient that it is in beer. But yes. The sugar comes from the grain, yes. So there's a variety of different grains that can be used in beer, but predominantly barley is the grain. As you really get the best bang for the buck, you get the most sugars out of barley than any other grain from a palatable standpoint. There's other grains that can give you sugars too, but it's not nearly as palatable as barley is. So that over centuries became the predominant ingredient. But really they were growing barley in the Middle East, and that's why that grain initially started out. But up until a couple of years ago, they thought beer was about 6,000 years old. And it wasn't until 2 years ago, they recently discovered, and this is a photograph of a brewery discovered in what is now Israel that dates back 13,000 years. So, fairly amazing that we have almost, more than doubled the time of what we thought beer existed. And beer is the oldest, or the second oldest known beverage, besides water, but man-made beverage next to tea. It by far predates wine. So brewing really was prominent in the Middle East and Egypt and Samaria and what's now Iraq. But the top left is a tablet that was found, a 6,000-year-old tablet that actually depicts people drinking beer. They are drinking it out of communal straws, if you can see it on that tablet. And on the bottom right is actually a recipe that was found in a pyramid about 5,000 years ago. And that truly is a recipe on how to make beer. And here on the top right, you see a Sumerian tablet that is actually a recipe, and it's a hymn to the goddess Ninkasi. And like a lot of things back then, they had various gods for various things in Egypt, for God to make it rain and God to not make it rain. But there was a god for, or a goddess for fermentation. Because again, no one knew what yeast was, it just happened. So it was magical. They would pray to the gods for that fermentation to take place. We know now that certain conditions have to be right. You got to have the right sugar levels. You got to have the right temperatures for the yeast. And back then, it was just natural airborne yeast that would happen. And they actually think that beer was discovered somewhat by accident. And archaeologists argue on this, but they think that it was discovered by someone had a loaf of bread that it was sitting outside in a bowl. It rained. That bread got wet, soggy, sat out there for a few days. Natural airborne yeast started working those sugars in the bread and created alcohol in this soggy mess. Then some brave soul went up to it and ate it, got a buzz, and said, we got to figure out how to replicate this. And I say that funny, but they really do think that that is one variation of how beer got started. And there are arguments that really beer predated bread, and really the civilization as we know it started with the cultivation of crops for making beer before bread. There's anthropologists that argue that, or bread. It's probably a combination of the two, but that's right, exactly. And on the bottom left is some Egyptian hieroglyphs. These were actually pulled out of a pyramid, and they show the brewing process. In other parts of the world, there was beer being made as well. In Asia, we all are probably familiar with sake. Sake, a lot of people call it a rice wine. Technically, it's a beer because, again, it's a grain. It's a beverage made from rice, which is a grain. So sake is technically a beer. And a lot of people see, like on menus, cider classified as a beer. And technically, cider would be a wine because it's made from fruit, mostly apples. So they were making beer, a form of beer called sake in Asia. And here in the Americas, they were making a beverage called chicha, which was primarily made from corn or maize. And the interesting thing here, and you can see in this little sketch, that it looks like that woman is spitting into a bowl. And that is exactly what she is doing. In the Americas, predominantly in South America, they would take the corn, and rather than going through the brewing process, doing a mash that we'll talk a little bit more about that, but they would take the grains, and this would mostly be women sitting around in the community while the men were out hunting. The women would take those grains, put in their mouth, chew them up. The saliva, actually the enzymes in the saliva works perfectly in breaking down the starches in the grain to fermentable sugars. So it'd break down that corn, they would spit it out into a big bowl, of course, mix it with more water, and it would ultimately ferment, and then people would drink it. And that was called chicha. So that's really how brewing was happening for thousands of years. There really was not a science to it. It was more by accident or praying for something to happen. But the Romans, as they got into the Middle East, they brought that beer process back with them. A lot of people think of Italy as wine country, but actually they brought that brewing process back with them. And ultimately, as they were building the roads up through Europe, they brought that brewing process with them, and it really took off in northern France, Belgium, England, of course, Ireland, Germany, and really throughout Europe, that brewing process took off. So when the Roman Empire fell, we just had these little pockets of community scattered throughout Europe that really were no longer connected that much. But the church started taking over, kind of picking up where the Roman Empire left off. And for really the next 1,000 years, from about 500 to 1500 AD, the Catholic Church was the primary source of brewing. And these were in monasteries scattered all throughout Europe. And they really changed the brewing process into more of a science. Starting out, it was more just taking best practices. And then a little later on, as things started to develop more, they kind of got into the science of things. But prior to that, brewing was pretty much done at home. Very small process, typically like what you think of as home brewing now. That's what they were doing. There were no commercial breweries at that time. It was just basically for your local community or for your neighbors. But then the church brought it into the monasteries, and they did that for a number of reasons: quality control, of course, money, bringing money into the church to sell the beer, but also to bring people into the church simply because beer was boiled. And in the Middle Ages, there are lots of plagues in Europe, and a lot of times water be contaminated, and they use that as kind of leverage to bring people into the church to hear, we got this beverage that will not kill you when you drink it. And so that was another thing that the monasteries did as well. Here's just a famous quote from Saint Arnold, who is the patron saint of brewing. He was from Belgium, and from man's sweat and God's love, beer came into the world. And I just think that's a great quote. There's actually quite a few saints related to beer and the brewing process. And as Jim mentioned when I spoke before, I was speaking to the Catholic Business League. That entire presentation was essentially on the Catholic Church and how it intertwines with beer. And I'm not going to go down that far, but I did want to mention just a couple of saints here. In Ireland, we think of St. Patrick, obviously, but really St. Patrick had absolutely nothing to do with beer. What he did was he spread Christianity throughout Ireland, and I think the Irish use that as a good excuse to drink beer on St. Patrick's Day. But really, there is a patron saint of beer in Ireland. Her name was Saint Bridget of Kildare, also known as the Mary of Gale. And she did several miracles related to beer. And she was alive the same time as St. Patrick, towards the end of his life. And she really followed his process in his ministry throughout Ireland. But one miracle she did, apparently on a feast day during Lent, there are all these churches and they were out of beer, and she was able to multiply the beer out of one barrel to feed the community in these 18 churches. And another thing she did, and this is a more famous thing, they had a leper colony that her monastery was caring for. And she actually, supposedly converted all the dirty bathwater into beer for the lepers to drink. And so, beer is boiled, yeah. And probably more likely water was used, whether it be bath water or not, but it was boiled and became, beer. But whether it be bath water or not, I'm not going to argue with that. Another famous saint, Saint Benedict, he actually is not directly related to beer, but he really created the Benedictine order that established the monasteries throughout Europe and how they would provide for travelers, and a big part of that was brewing beer. So if it wasn't for Saint Benedict, all these monasteries probably would not be brewing beer. And later, Saint Amand in northern France and what's now Belgium was really famous for establishing the breweries in these monasteries following that Benedictine order. And because he had the reputation for hospitality with people coming, he is known as the patron saint for beer and wine merchants. And finally, that quote I mentioned earlier, St. Arnold of Metz, he really is known as the patron saint of beer, and he's patron saint of Belgium. And he, a couple of different things he did, but the biggest thing that he is known for was getting the people into the church to drink beer, as I mentioned earlier, instead of the water. Because the water truly was, a lot of times in a lot of areas contaminated. And they just didn't have the science back then to understand why. But they knew people weren't getting sick drinking beer. And originally it was the men were surviving, the women and children were dying. And then they started realizing the women and children were drinking water versus the beer. And so it really became a beverage for everyone.
Don't drink water, drink beer.
That's right. And another miracle that happened after his death, when they were moving his body to put in his permanent tomb, one of the tired porters that was carrying this big stone sarcophagus kind of fell down his knees and pleaded to God that he wished he had some beer to drink. And all of a sudden, beer came flowing out from the casket. So that's another thing that he is famous for. And then finally, Hildegard, she is actually not a saint, but she was a nun. And so she didn't actually complete any miracles. But the one thing that she did, she was somewhat of an herbalist. And she really is the first, or credited to be the first person to start adding hops into beer. And that was about 1,000 years ago. And she was actually keeping journals. And keep in mind, the monasteries were really the only people that were educated, were the monks and the nuns. Outside of that, in the Middle Ages, most people were not educated outside of the church. So not only were universities really established through the monasteries and hospitals, but the brewing process and the science of brewing also too. They started logging and what are we doing that is good and what are we doing that's bad, and starting comparing batches of beer and really start perfecting the process. And then the monks that were brewers would travel around to different monasteries and teach others to brew. But hops, as I mentioned briefly, hops offsets the sweetness in beers. You think about it, it's basically sugar water. From the grain, you're getting the color of the grain, and that's where we get the color of our beer. But also all the sugars. So it'd be extremely sweet because it's not all 100% fermentable sugars. There are residual sugars, and that's where we get the calories that beer has. So it'd be very sweet. So they would use a variety of things to offset that sweetness, really throughout the world, depending on where you live. But it'd be a variety of herbs or berries or bark or whatever to offset some of that sweetness. And when they discovered that hops offset that sweetness, but also there are essential oils in hops that act as a preservative, because beer would spoil. It'd start to mold after a while. Beer is a perishable product, just like milk. It does last a little bit longer, but without cold or without hops, beer would spoil. So obviously they didn't have refrigeration back then. So hops was the first thing that really started preserving beer. And has everyone heard of the style IPA, Indian Pale Ale? Does anyone know where it got that name or why it's called that? So in the late early 1800s, when the British had troops in India and they were sending cargo supplies and everything to their troops, back then they would have to go around the Cape of Africa, and it'd be a 6 or 8 week journey. And of course they had beer as part of those supplies, where the beer would spoil. So they started over hopping the beer, putting in a lot more hops than what the regular beer at the time was known for, so it would survive the journey and not be moldy by the time it got to India. And it became known as its own style, and that's where Indian Pale Ale came from. So, little tidbit fact. Now you know. So, as I was talking about these monasteries, and these really were the primary areas of brewing, a lot of these monasteries are still brewing today. Of course, not all of them. A lot of them have closed over the centuries. There's our breweries, too, that have taken on the names of some of these monasteries, and so they refer to themselves as an abbey beer, but to be a Trappist beer. And has anyone heard the term Trappist before? So a Trappist community follows that Benedictine order, and they are a community of monks that ultimately devote their lives to their monastery, and the work that they do and the products that they make are purely to support the monastery and the community around them. That's it. That's all they do. So there are Trappist products, whether it be, and there's some Trappist monasteries in the United States too, but they may do fruit cakes or different arts and crafts, wine, liqueurs, but beer is certainly one of them. And there are 12 Trappist breweries in the world today. And those are some of the most coveted beers that you can get. 6 of those, in fact, I'll show you here. 6 of those Trappist breweries are in Belgium, 2 are in the Netherlands, 1 is in Austria, 1 in Italy, 1 in England, and 1 here in the United States, just outside of Boston. So those are their 12 Trappist breweries, and they have to go through a regiment cycle in order to be classified as Trappist. And that classification really came about because everyone started calling their beer Trappist beer. There's no designation, and so the Trappist Society came into play for all these products and said you have to meet these certain classifications in order to call yourself a Trappist product, or in this case, a Trappist beer. So some of these are available in the United States. The one on the top left, Chimay, is by far the biggest and most popular Trappist beer. And you can get that like at Frugal McDougal's or Midtown here on Church Street, or most craft beer stores are going to have Chimay. A couple of these other you can get in the United States, but the rest are fairly difficult to get. The one on the bottom right, West-Verlaten, that is in the northwest region of Belgium, and that is extremely difficult to obtain. They just make a small amount because all they want to do is make enough to support their community, and they only have about a dozen monks there, so they don't have to make a lot. And they release the beer one day a year. People line up in cars, and they're allowed one case each. But it's then turned around and sold on the black market, and people pay $100 for a bottle of that beer. So. Desirable, yeah. It's it's kind of like wine. I mean, obviously, you say this tastes so much better than something else, but there's a lot more of it. Some of it I think is just because it is so hard to get. But they did a couple years in a row got rated through judges as the best beer in the world. So that really got their name out there about 25 years ago. But they've been brewing beer for centuries. But from a commercialization standpoint, that got out, and then in blind taste tests that people didn't even know what it was. Yeah. But that style they have several different styles of beer, as most breweries do. But it's their West-Verlaten 12 is the one that is rated so high. And it's about a 10% beer, so a little higher in alcohol. And it's referred to as a quad or a quadruple. And generally speaking, it's quadruple the amount of grain that goes in there from a normal batch. And so it gets that higher alcohol. So, we'll be talking a lot about Belgium, these monasteries. Over on the other side of the Alps in Bavaria, there are certainly monasteries brewing beer there too, that a lot of these brands we know of today. One of the most famous is Weihenstephan, and you can get their beer at a lot of places here in town. Again, a craft beer retailer, but Von Elrod's, if anyone has been there in Germantown, or some of the other beer restaurants will have Weihenstephan, and they are considered the world's oldest continually operated brewery. They've been operating about 1,000 years now. Monastery dates back a few hundred years before that. But they are known for a wheat beer that they do, and it's a great beer. Highly recommend it. But the monastery, their picture on the top left, you can still go visit that. That's actually a painting. And the bottom right is a photograph of the Weltenberg Abbey. Both of these are in Bavaria, outside of Munich. One's about an hour north, one's about an hour south of Munich. But that brewery is about 1,000 years old as well. They tend to argue back and forth which one is the older brewery, but its records show that Weltenberg is about 10 years younger than Weihenstephan. Both of them famous. Weltenberg is still an abbey to this day. Weihenstephan is a private now, but both of them still making beer. Yeah, exactly. A couple other famous monastery breweries in actual Munich. Augustiner, has anyone heard of Augustiner? So they were a monastery that really dates back to the 1300s, and they've been private now for almost 200 years. But they used to make the beer for the royal family in Bavaria until they wised up and said, hey, we just need to start making our own beer. And that's where the Hofbrauhaus came from. Everyone heard of Hofbrau, or the Hofbrauhaus in Munich, and that's a famous beer hall. And ultimately, that brewery was initially established to make beer for the royal family. There's also Paulaner, which Paulaner was founded by St. Francis of Paula, and that's where the name came from. And they were a monastery brewery as well. And they are really credited for inventing the style of Bock beer. Those of you that have heard of Bock beer, Bock beer traditionally would be served in Lent. And I briefly touched on that earlier, where it was a stronger beer made with a lot more grains to supplement the calorie intake during fasting, during Lent. So you can't talk about Munich without talking about Oktoberfest. So I've been quite a few times. Jim, have you been to Oktoberfest in Germany? Yeah. So if you ever have the opportunity to go, I highly recommend it. But it's a good time. But Oktoberfest started in 1810, although they had fall festivals in Germany, really throughout the world. But we call them harvest festivals. That's really what Oktoberfest initially was a harvest festival. What's that? Oh yeah. There you go. But in 1810, Prince Ludwig, who was the son of the king of Bavaria, he was getting married to his fiancée Teresa, and the king decided to have a big wedding celebration and invite all the town commoners of Munich. And at the time, that was very rare that commoners would be invited to a royal wedding, but he wanted everyone to come. And so he broke out all the beer that had been stored. And storing beer in German is called lagering or lager. That's where lager beer comes from. We'll talk a little bit. There's some science behind that. But all the beer that had been storing all summer long that normally would be broken out of the fall festivals. So we're going to break this out and serve it at my son's wedding, and everyone can have it. And that was in 1810. And to this day, Oktoberfest has always been at that same location. It's a big park now called Teresa Platz in Munich, named after the princess. And Oktoberfest has always been held there with the exception of last year. And about 10 other times we did not have Oktoberfest in the past 200 years. And that was either due to plague or war. So it was just I was actually planning on going this past year. So, and they canceled fairly early. They canceled last March. And I was just baffled at that time. COVID was still fairly new, trying to figure out what it was. And I just thought they jumped the gun canceling it, but obviously that was the right decision. So at Oktoberfest in Munich, there are 6 breweries that are allowed to serve there. You will not find any other beer at Oktoberfest besides these 6 breweries that you see there on the screen. And the reason being is those were the original 6 breweries that were within the city walls of Munich at the time of that original Oktoberfest. And to this day, no other brewery is allowed to participate in Oktoberfest. Everyone has a favorite. So we got Augustiner, Paulaner, Lowenbrau, Hofbrau. I gotta put my glasses on here to Spaten and Heckershore would be the 6. So in Milwaukee's best. So in that bottom center picture, you see I'm in a cellar there. Augustiner is known for their beer kellers or cellar. And you can have dinner down there in these cellars. Each one is about 100 yards long. They're huge. And that's where they used to lager the beer centuries ago. And up on top above that, if you look at the top picture there, that's at the same place. I'm in their beer garden. They have the largest beer garden in the world, and it seats like 5,000 people. And the beer gardens came about when they started digging out beer cellars. They needed a way to keep the sun from heating the ground too much to warm up the beer underneath the ground, even though it's about 3 stories down. So they started planting chestnut trees there to shade the area. And ultimately, people started hanging out under those chestnut trees, and that's the beer garden as we know it today. So we can't talk about Munich or German beer and not talk about pretzels. And there's not a saint of pretzels, but actually pretzels were originated in a monastery in northern Italy. There's a couple reasons for that, but back then during Lent, they were having unleavened bread and with some leftover dough. One of the monks started rolling around and playing with it. And that famous pretzel twist that we know of with that shape was actually, he was replicating prayer in that. You see the cartoon of the monk on the top right there in prayer. And that's where that shape came from. And he actually used that for teaching purposes to teach children how to say their prayers. He would use the 3 holes in the pretzel to represent the Holy Trinity. And, that was in 600 AD, and we go up almost 1,000 years. Pretzels were famous. They were being made all over the place at that point in Austria and Germany and throughout. But in Austria, Vienna was being invaded by the Ottomans, and there were some monks up in the middle of the night baking bread, or very early in the morning baking bread and pretzels. And while they were making their pretzels, they observed the Ottomans tunneling under the city walls, and they alerted the authorities, and they saved the city of Vienna at that time, only because they were up making pretzels. So, the church really kind of, mastered the brewing process. The science was still a little iffy, and the main reason is because we didn't know what yeast was. But in Germany, they really started making beer brewing into law. And in 1420, in 1516, they established the Reinheitsgebot. And did I pronounce that all right, Jim? All right. And what that is, it's among other things, it's a German purity law. And it stated that beer can only consist of water, barley, and hops, nothing else. Because at that time, people were using outside of the monasteries, people were using other stuff to try and make beer and make money. And they said, nope, this is the only ingredients that can be used in beer. It's not called beer if you're not using that. They later added yeast once we figured out what yeast was. But at that time, yeast was not an ingredient. Also in the 1500s, beer started being shifted from the church into more of a commercial setting. We'll talk a little bit about why, but also around this time, lager beer really started taking off in Bavaria. And so really, what is lager beer? And there's two styles of beer. If you think of wine, red wine and white wine, and you got a ton of varieties of each, right? Beer, you have ales and you have lagers and a ton of varieties of each. Up until about 1,000 years ago, all beer was ale. It was just that natural airborne yeast that pretty much would ferment sugars at room temperature, or sometimes we refer to it as cellar temperature. But that's what beer was, and that's how, or that's what the yeast was, and that's how beer is being made for thousands of years. And in Germany, as they were starting to perfect this process, they had a couple things happening. In the summer, they knew when they were brewing, fires were breaking out all the time because everything was an open flame brew kettle at that point. Cities were burning down because of these fires, so they had to put an end to that. But really the more important reason is they also realized in these summer months and the warmer months, as I mentioned before about beer spoiling, contaminants would really start growing in the beer rather quickly in the summer rather than in the winter. So they decided to outlaw brewing in the summer months. And so they would stop brewing. The end of the brewing season would be in March. And they would then start storing their beer in caves. Later, they would dig out cellars, but initially in caves. And they would cut out ice from the local lakes and at the end of the winter and stuff the caves with beer and ice to keep the beer throughout the summer since they couldn't brew. So they would have that beer to drink off of throughout the summer months. And then in the fall, and that's what they referred to as old beer. So it was lagering throughout the summer. And then they would, in the fall, they would drink up all that old beer because now they could start making new beer again. And that's where part of that Oktoberfest I mentioned earlier about busting out the cellars and drinking all that beer at the wedding, how that started about. But from a scientific standpoint, in these colder temperatures, the beer would not ferment like it did at room temperature with ale yeast or the natural airborne yeast that we know of. But over the centuries in these caves, another form of yeast was starting to react with these sugars in the beer, and it'd take much longer to ferment, but it'd be a crisper beer with a different type of flavor, not nearly as harsh as an ale. And that ultimately became what we know of as lager. And they started differentiating these two yeasts. If you think of sourdough bread, where you take, a friendship bread, where a batch of bread from the old batch and add it to the new batch, that's what they started doing with beer when they realized in this other style, and it just didn't happen overnight. It, again, with centuries, but they would start taking beer from an old batch, add it to the new batch, really separating those yeast cells. And it ultimately wasn't until the 1800s where they truly were able to identify these yeast cells with the microscope and separate them. And that's the two styles of beer that we know of today. So in 1517, we had the beer Reformation. We also had another Reformation within the church, but the beer Reformation also included Martin Luther. And part of what he did in breaking away from the Catholic Church was he also insisted on breweries breaking away from the Catholic Church and is credited for starting the commercial brewery revolution in Germany that we know of and really spread throughout the world, but breaking breweries away from the monasteries. And one thing reason what they say he did that was his wife, which if anyone knows history of Martin Luther, his wife was actually a nun, and she left the Catholic Church with him, but she was a brewer. And so they started their own commercial brewery in their hometown in Germany, and she brewed beer for that entire community. But one of the reasons why he really wanted to break away was the church. I was talking about hops earlier, about 500 years before this, how the monastery started adding hops to beer. They kept that as a secret. That was their own thing, and that was the church beer was very different than any other beer you would get outside. And there was a mix of herbs that were used and sold and very heavily taxed, and that was called Grut. And Martin Luther saw, hey, we need to get away from this, let everyone have hops and start using hops and not letting the church tax this product that really makes crappy beer anyways. So he's credited for doing a number of things and really kind of getting beer out there to the commoners outside of the church. And he's got this quote I like: whoever drinks beer, he is quick to sleep. Whoever sleeps long does not sin. You can't sin if you're sleeping, right? And whoever does not sin enters heaven. Therefore, let us drink beer.
Go to sleep.
How am I on time? 5-10 minutes. All right. So, okay. So the Industrial Revolution really kicked off the science of brewing. And in the 1700s, certain key instruments, including the brewing thermometer, the steam engines, we no longer had fires, and the hydrometer, which is how we measure the alcohol content, or there's really the sugar content in the beers. Those really made a big difference. As well as the kiln process for malting barley, starting using a kiln. That was invented in England in the late 1700s. But the Germans went to England and really kind of stole that process and how to make pale malt. Prior to that, all beer was dark. So prior to the 1700s, any beer you got was going to be dark because they were roasting the grains. Once we got the kiln and they learned how to kiln that, that's where we got pale ales in England, and then our light German lagers that we know of today. And the Spaten Brewery is really known for kind of really perfecting that process. And then 1876, very important date, is Louis Pasteur unraveled the secrets of yeast. And that's really where all that came from. And he invented pasteurization as well. A lot of people think that was done for the milk, but actually he invented pasteurization for preserving beer, and then it was adopted for milk later. Meanwhile, in America, we had breweries developing here on the colonists. A lot of people say that, in fact, it's in the logs of the Mayflower, that the reason why the Pilgrims landed where they did at Plymouth Rock is because they were out of supplies, including beer, and they wanted to get ashore so they could start brewing beer. And that's actually in the ship's logs. They were actually planning on going down much further south. But in the 1800s, we had a huge German immigration in the United States, and with that, they brought their science of brewing with them. And by the 1870s, we had 4,000 breweries in the United States. And then we started seeing a big decline. A lot of that was due to consolidation as well as the temperance movement. And then later we had Prohibition, of course. And Prohibition went into place in 1919. It lasted until 1933. So after Prohibition, we only had 756 breweries that started back up. And really because of more consolidations from regional breweries into national breweries. And a big reason for that was the television. Breweries that were able to afford and advertise on this new thing that we had called television. People wanted Budweiser everywhere, no matter where they were. So those breweries that could afford to ship and refrigerate rail cars and advertise nationally really took off. And by 1984, we only had 44 brewing companies in the United States. So of course they had different brands, but 44 breweries in the United States. Another important date, in 1976, Jimmy Carter legalized home brewing. Prior to that, it was illegal to home brew in the United States. And there's a picture of his brother. I don't know if anyone remembers Billy Carter. He came out with his own beer and did not make it. But in the late 70s, the microbrewery revolution started taking off for the craft brewing industry. And in 1995, we had 800 breweries in the United States. A couple of them were here in Nashville. And by 2012, we had 2,500 breweries, and we are now almost at 9,000 breweries in the United States. So we have just, the past 20 years have just really taken off. We got time to briefly talk about brewing in Nashville? All right, so this is a map of Nashville in 1804. You can see it was just a small pioneer town. Not a whole lot going on, but the reason that Nashville was founded, if you see where I got the mouse there, right there, is that that Salt Lick spring that is in Germantown that we know of today. And that's really why how Nashville got founded is, I mean, the Native Americans were hunting there for years. They attracted buffalo and everything. So, you know, trappers started going there and really became a city. So in 1815, we had our first breweries in Nashville. The first one was on what's now Charlotte Pike, about a mile west of Nashville. And the second one was the brewery Mill Creek, and that's out on Elm Hill Pike out towards the airport. I had historical markers put in both of those locations. So that's right there on Charlotte at the Ascend Credit Union. And ironically, it's very close to my brewery. And then the Mill Creek marker went in about a year ago. And again, that's out on Elm Hill Pike. Nothing to do with the Mill Creek Brewery in Nolensville. In fact, they didn't realize that there was a historical brewery with that name. I mentioned mass German immigration in the mid 1800s into the United States, and a lot of them came into Nashville and really developed Germantown as we know it. This is, some of you may have seen this photo. This is the oldest photo known of Nashville. That's right up there at Capitol Square there, from the 1850s. But the Germans all immigrated into North Nashville, and that became known as Germantown. And they built at the foreground there, you see the Church of the Assumption, which was the first Catholic church in Germantown. Nashville did have another Catholic church, St. Mary's, but that was built purely for the German community. And you can see the Capitol building in the background. And both of those were built in 1859. So they were built the same year, right before the Civil War. And I just took these two pictures. I thought it was interesting of, you see in the foreground, the church there in Germantown, and then the Capitol in the background. I tried to get the same angle as best as I could. Ironically, a couple months after I took that photo on the bottom, the tornado came through and it knocked the steeple off. So if I took that picture now, it actually looked more like the church because it didn't have the tall steeple back then. But in the 1860s, Germantown actually had 4 breweries operating simultaneously, all within a few blocks of each other. And so, of course, I had to put in a historical marker for that as well. But also in 1859, the Nashville Brewing Company opened, and this was the first production brewery. Those other breweries in Germantown were basically home breweries, and this was a brewery built on 6th Avenue South, so on the backside of the Gulch. And this was the first production brewery in Nashville, and it operated at that same location until 1954. Though it changed names over the years. It was the Nashville Brewing Company from 1859 to 1890. And some of you may be familiar with the Gerst name, the Gerst Brewing Company or the Gerst House. So it became Gerst in 1890, and it was the William Gerst Brewing Company until 1954 when it closed. And then William Gerst's grandson started the first Gerst House restaurant, which was on 2nd Avenue in 1955, ultimately moving several times until it closed just a few years ago, right across from the stadium. Of course, I have a historical marker where that original Nashville Brewing and Gerst Brewing Company were. And I'm just going to skip, that's a photograph of the Nashville Brewing Company from the 1880s. It's just some advertising from Gerst. That's what really got me into stuff, was collecting the advertising. William Gerst had a racehorse, only Tennessee racehorse to win the Kentucky Derby in 1910. Its name was Danu. Danu is German for the Danube River. William Gerst died in 1933. He's buried in Cincinnati. That's where he initially immigrated to, and later came to Nashville. But that's his grave in Cincinnati. And unfortunately, he died about a month before Prohibition ended. So he never saw the end of Prohibition. But he had 4 sons that continued operating the brewery until it closed in 1954. Cincinnati's got some great tours, yeah.
Just the tours in Cincinnati are pretty good.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mentioned I really got into collecting beer advertising. I started out collecting beer cans when I was 6 years old. And then from there, by the time I was in high school, I had about 3,000. Yeah. I was just picking them up off the side of the road. And then,
That's why I went to Ohio State.
Yeah.
They kept drinking it.
Well, I started home brewing in my dorm in Ohio State, and that's a way to make you popular. But about 10 years ago, or 15 years ago now, I wrote this book called Nashville Brewing. And that was still really before the craft beer revolution really took off. We had some breweries here in Nashville, but I wrote this book, and the cover of the book, as you see there, is anyone, well, I kind of give it away. I've got a photograph of it. Yeah, so that's the gift shop to the Hard Rock Cafe. But that photograph is from about 1895 there on the top left, and that's what the publishers wanted to use as the cover of my book. But as you see where the awning is for the gift shop, that's right where those guys are standing. That's really what's, I started getting into the history of things, and then ultimately decided to launch the Nashville Brewing Company. Had partnered with Blackstone. Some of you may remember the Blackstone Brew Pub on West End Avenue. That closed about 5 years ago, and that was a restaurant with a small brewery, and that's Nashville's oldest craft brewery since 1994. But 10 years ago, they built a production brewery on Clifton Avenue, just off of Charlotte, real close to that historical marker that I mentioned. And that's I was friends with the owners and was able to get involved. And I had the trademark to Nashville Brewing Company, and we thought, let's start brewing some traditional German lagers under the Nashville Brewing Company name and market it. That and I actually own some of the original recipes. In fact, I own the original Gerst recipes. That I acquired while researching my book. So so we started brewing these about 4 years ago, and we got a variety of brands, and you can get them at Kroger or at a lot of bars and restaurants around town. So again, you can drink it at most bars and restaurants. Carry our beer.
Do you have a place?
Yeah, so our brewery, we have a tap room. We are open 4 o'clock on weekdays, except for Mondays. We're not open Mondays right now, but 4 o'clock Tuesday through Friday, and then all day Saturday and Sunday. Clifton Avenue, just off of Charlotte, where Clifton splits off right behind Centennial Park. It's Blackstone Brewing Company and Blackstone Brewing Company. So we got 2 brands, 1 brewery. Yeah.
So you got relative associates.
Just really across from Charlotte from there. Yeah. So kind of Clifton branches off like right at 21st Avenue.
That's your second time hobby, right? Taxes.
Yeah, well, I'm not a tax guy. I have a healthcare practice. I do more revenue cycle consulting for hospitals, but one pays the bills and one is the tax write-off.
Scott, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Scott, we got something for you to do for us before you leave. You could grab one of these tickets and